Hey everybody. So if you watched my first video for this series of two videos, I talked about how film has changed since the early 1900s all the way to the 70s. And for this video, I want to talk about how film has changed since the 80s, and in some ways how it's changed since the 90s as well. Um, so let's get started because I have a lot of points I want to cover with this video. First off, since the 80s, we saw a lot of films that took place in a high school environment for some reason. I think in the 80s, I think for people, especially, like teens and early, I would say, like teens and young adults, I think a lot of filmmakers thought that if a film took place in a high school environment, that people could understand it more since we've all gone through high school. Um, I think obviously in today's film world, I mean, there's really is no reliable environment. It's all over the place, all over the world where people film movies now. Just looking back at the 80s, it seems like a lot of films took place in a high school environment. It was the John Hughes era. It was the kind of like the old prom night movies and stuff like that. Um, so like I said, I think just a lot of people seemed to have gotten it if it took place in a high school. Um, so that's just one thing I've noticed is we don't see, even though there are a lot of films to take place in high school, it seems like the 80s seem to rely on that environment in order for the story to work, kind of a thing. Um, Also, it seems like the 80s had a lot of hokier one liners. I mean, look at all the Arnold Schwarzenegger films that came out in that decade. Look at all of the, just action hero films in general, like Chuck Norris and Stallone films and, Stallone's Rambo films. I think Die Hard 1 came out in like 87 or 88, I think. Just look at all the hokey one liners. And even though that still exists in today's world, I think it just feels more special for that era because it felt so fresh for that time. Even going back to it, still feels very fresh and very new. And just very hokey and corny in a fun way. So that's one thing I kind of miss about the 80s is I think even though films like The Expendables and Machete and all that stuff try to repeat that funness of a film, I think it's truly a film has to truly come from the 80s in order to make it feel like it belongs from that era. Um, to me, it seems like there wasn't as much reasoning or explanation for certain things in the 80s. A good example of these are films such like Back to the Future and Nightmare on Elm Street. Those had very complex rules and ground rules for those cinematic worlds. And in today's world, we have things like Inception and even Nightmare on Elm Street was remade a couple of years ago. It seems like films today have to have more explanation and more reasoning. And even though that did exist in the 80s, it felt like people weren't always asking why about it. They're like, it's not one of those things where if there's not a reasoning for every single thing you do in the film, people, back in the day, they wouldn't complain about it. They just saw the movie for what it was. But in today's world, if there's not enough reason or explanation behind things, people start to get angry, they get mad, they start to hate the film. I think people hated Inception simply because it was such a complex thing. And if you're a Nolan fan like me, obviously we think those people are crazy because it was such a great film, and we thought it explained things well enough. Um, but still, there's people today I think that think higher of those kind of things. They had to think, okay, well, what's the reasoning behind that? What's the reasoning behind that? And what's the reasoning behind that? Films like Back to the Future. I mean, there's a lot of things about the space time continuum in that film that, even though they explained it, um, things like why would a paradox happen when the same person encountered the same person? Well, we did see that play out in the film and there wasn't a paradox. And people in today's world would be like, okay, then how come that paradox didn't happen, kind of a thing. Um, Also, because the 80s was also the birth of MTV, a lot of films back then, specifically films like Do the Right Thing and like Ferris Bueller's Day Off and everything. They seem to have a lot of music video style scenes. Breakfast Club was another example. Um, and I don't think they do that a lot in 2012. I think simply because music videos have been around for so long and MTV was a huge thing in the 80s and it was new and fresh and hip and happening. I think every film back then had to feel like it was a music video in some way. And it just doesn't seem like that's very existent in today's world. That's one thing I've noticed about 80s films and today's films, that there's a lot more music video styled scenes that were made for that era. Um, Things occurring on other planets was another habit that happened a lot in the 80s. Look at the Total Recall film from back then, and look at the Total Recall film now. Back in the day, they said, well, it just takes place on Mars. It's like, oh, okay, I get it. And now in today's world, it's like, it has to take place on Earth. If it doesn't take place on Earth, people aren't going to get it. And like if it doesn't take place in a realistic world, people aren't going to get it, kind of a thing. So it seems like back in the day, people just said, "Oh, it just takes place on another planet," and then all of a sudden, everything made sense, kind of a thing. But you know what? The '80s was so cool. I mean, we didn't need that enough reasoning of why it took place on Mars or Pluto or Neptune and all that stuff. Back in the day, it was just like, okay, it takes place on another planet, therefore we don't have to worry about the Earth rules on there. Um, Also, back in the 80s, it seems like a lot of the action heroes were very muscular, very borderline steroid use kind of a thing. I mean, look at Schwarzenegger and Stallone and Norris, and even though all of them still act now, back in the day, it was like borderline steroids. Um, and it seems like even in today's world, those action heroes still exist. I think where our society is more accepting now that our action heroes don't have to be muscular every time we have one. Look at the new Spider-Man film. I mean, there wasn't a muscle on Andrew Garfield in that movie, and he managed to be Spider-Man. Um, Christian Bale is strong, but look at his body compared to Schwarzenegger's in the '80s, and it's just like, whoa, that guy's nothing, kind of a thing. Um, so I think in today's world, people want to have a more realistic action hero, and that's why we don't see as many muscular heroes. Because back in the day, that's kind of how people viewed an action hero, and in today's world, it's like, well, if you can prove to me or show me something that shows that he's an action hero, I'll believe him or her throughout the movie. Romance felt more special back in the '80s too. Like, look at a film like 16 Candles and Weird Science and all the John Hughes films. Woody Allen, I think that was his second decade where he was very big. It just felt more special. It felt like, you know, the moment in 16 Candles where Molly Ringwald and Jake Ryan are on um, a table, and Jake Ryan asked her to make a wish, and she said, "Well, it already came true," kind of a thing. I think a lot of romance films today don't seem to have that magic that 16 Candles had. Um, I really miss that. I think a lot of other people really miss that about 80s films too. With Weird Science, I mean, Kelly LeBrock was the woman back then. I mean, she really taught those two kids, I mean, what love really was based off of that crazy night of battling for these two teen girls that they really liked in high school as well. Um, the slasher film era, I mean, back in the 80s, I mean, look at Friday the 13th alone. I mean, there was a sequel almost every single year in that era, and it was just a huge thing. I mean, so many people paid good money to go see those films. Just so many sequels back in the day, and even though there are a lot of sequels now, back in the day, it was very ridiculous, specifically with Halloween and Friday the 13th and all that stuff. Slasher film was huge back then, or the slasher film era was huge back then. Um, Also, it seemed like the 80s had always had an over exaggerated thought on the future. And a good example of this is Back to the Future Part 2. Like there was Jaws 19, and there was automatic locking shoes with Nike, and there was hoverboards. There was a huge speculation about hoverboards where I think Robert Zemeckis said they actually used hoverboards, and it turns out they lied and just said, it was just special effects with skateboards. Um, and I think, people were always thinking about what the future was going to look like because we weren't even in the 2000s yet. And people are like, wouldn't it be cool if we had this? Wouldn't it be cool if we had that? And I think because we're living in that era now where back in the day people thought we were going to have all those things, I think just people are like, you know what, let's just go with the flow and see what time and technology gives us. So it seems like the 80s always had an over exaggerated view on the future. And that's all I got, guys. Like I said with my previous video, if you have any comments or things you felt I left out with the '80s, um, compared to today's world of film, feel free to leave a comment. I'm very open, and I'm sure other people would like to hear, um, how film has changed since the era. Um, yeah, it just seems like films seem like a lot, kind of like what I said in my previous video. I mean, it just they seem a lot darker now. Um, Violence is more extreme now in film, and I think just people they're not after the magical feel anymore. I mean, I think people are more after the magical feel of film, and just something that feels magical when they're leaving the theater. They uh, they want it to exist in its own world and not have to worry about um, feeling like something that we just saw at someone's house, kind of a thing. So anyway, guys, if you have any comments, if you feel like I left something out, like I said, feel free to leave a comment, and hopefully you enjoyed this video.